The Lord be with you. Well, in a video or so ago, I spent some time talking about film and how movies and stories can often influence our psyche, kind of that inner self, and just affect subtly our theologies about how we see the world and how we see ourselves. And we sort of picked apart some Pixar movies. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that movies in and of themselves are bad, or that we should be hypercritical of all forms of media. I certainly have spent time in traditions that are skeptical about all forms of media, and that is not ultimately where I'm coming from. My book club actually read a very influential book for us about a year or so ago. It was called Movies Are Prayers, and it was by Josh Larsen. Josh Larsen is a Christian film critic, and he reviews all sorts of movies, secular movies. And in them, over the years, he has sort of seen how God is at work, or at least in the background of a lot of storylines. And he sees movies primarily as coming from this place where they represent our longings and our desires. Sometimes they're for beauty, sometimes they're for restoration or forgiveness, sometimes they're laments about the brokenness around us. And that is sort of a learned skill, being able to interpret things based upon how our faith has shaped us. There's actually a scholarly opinion that the Bible and film can relate in at least three ways. The first one would be Bible on film, and that's just where a film studio chooses to make a movie about an actual story from the Bible. So this would be like the Ten Commandments or Son of God or something like that, one of those movies where it's literally just filming one of the biblical stories. The second category is the Bible in film, and that isn't necessarily telling a story straight out of the Bible, but there could be an allusion or a quote of a Bible passage, either at the beginning or in the middle of a movie that influences the overall storyline of the movie. Or it could be kind of a reflection of a popular biblical story. So, for example, the life of Job has sort of been reflected in lots of movies without using the same names or the exact same scenarios. You just see people going through things where they're losing everything that's important to them, and they have struggles of faith and conscience. The final category is the Bible and film. And this is less about what's in the movie and more about how we as believers have been given eyes to see things through the lens of redemption. So even if a filmmaker doesn't overtly intend to make some sort of allusion or metaphor for something that's thematic in the Bible, we can still see it because somehow we have been trained to look for those kinds of things. I think that's kind of where Josh Larsen in his book is coming from. And that's what I want to talk to us about today, is how the eyes of faith can help us see movies in different ways. So I want to tell the story of one movie, and I didn't want to pick something easy. There are a lot of what are kind of the low-hanging fruit movies, the very easily Christian movies, things like Overcomer or Fireproof. And there's nothing wrong with those movies, but those movies are just sort of preaching to the choir. So if you are a believer and you're watching those movies, they're not telling you anything that you don't already believe. You don't have to engage them quite as deeply. What I'd like to do is take a movie that doesn't have as overt of Christian themes and sort of tell you how not only it has impacted me, but even some of those things that I have seen that have helped me struggle through some issues and have opened doors of conversation with other people who maybe don't want to talk about the Bible at all. So after some reflection, the film that I'm going to dissect for you a little bit is called Doubt. This is a movie from 2008. It has some very major Hollywood actors in it that you would recognize. It's actually adapted from a play by John Patrick Shanley. He wrote and directed the play. He also adapted and directed the movie, so it's very much a personal story of his. And it's about kind of the triangulation between three main characters in a Catholic parish as well as the Catholic school that's associated with that parish. So one of those main characters is Father Flynn, and he is new to that parish. He is a younger priest, has more progressive ideas, a little bit more in line with Vatican II, if you kind of know the struggle between Vatican I and Vatican II. And the first sermon that we see him deliver as he is new at his post as the priest of this particular parish, he gives a sermon on doubt. It's a very non-traditional sermon. And by the conclusion of it, he says, doubt is just as strong and binding as certainty. And if you find yourself lost, know that you are not alone. Now, that sermon, because it's very untraditional, it catches the attention of Sister Aloysius, that is the principal of the school. She is much older. She is very traditional. She is very stern. She is very firm. She sees things in black and white. And her and Father Flynn clash throughout the entirety of the story about any number of issues. But there's a third person, Sister James. She's very young, and she's drawn to both. She's drawn to Sister Aloysius. She's also drawn to Father Flynn, and she finds herself caught in the middle. So we as an audience sort of experience the movie through her eyes, and we're not sure what to think on a lot of issues either. But the thrust of the plot revolves around a crux incident where you're not entirely sure if Father Flynn has perhaps done something inappropriate or not. Sister Aloysius is convinced he has, but there's no proof. There's a lot of insinuation about things. And we as audience members are sort of pulled back and forth, just like Sister James is. Finally, things come to a conclusion, and Father Flynn and Sister Aloysius have to part ways. And in order to make that happen, they both have to sacrifice something. And Sister Aloysius, in the process of getting Father Flynn to make a sacrifice, she tells a lie. And the very end of the movie is her confessing to Sister James about her lie. And Sister James is just very hung up on that. How could she do that in the pursuit of what she believes is right? How can she do something wrong? And Sister Aloysius says, in the pursuit of wrongdoing, one steps away from God. And you're not entirely sure if she's referring to herself or to Father Flynn. And then she says, of course, there is a price to pay. And for a split second, you catch a glimpse of her holding her crucifix, and she tucks it under her shawl. And then as Sister James says, I think I understand. Sister Aloysius, quite uncharacteristically, there's this very hard, gruff woman through the entire story who raises her voice and is very loud and doesn't pull any punches. She breaks down crying in a moment of vulnerability, and she says, Sister James, I have doubts. I have such doubts. And that's the last line spoken in the movie. And Sister James sort of kneels at her feet and hugs her lap. And that's the end. And we as audience members are left to wonder, who's she talking about? What are the doubts? Are the doubts about whether or not Father Flynn actually did something wrong? were the doubts about whether or not her way of getting Father Flynn to leave was wrong? Are her doubts about the Christian institution, the church, and how it sometimes turns a blind eye when there are problems going on? Or is this seriously a crisis of faith for her in that moment? And we never know. And we are left to debate this. And most people I know who've seen this movie have long, drawn-out conversations about this. What do you think happened? What is your interpretation of it? And even more, how does that reflect upon us? Who are we more like? Sister James, Sister Aloysius, Father Flynn? Who are we drawn to as characters? What are our flaws? What are our doubts? And you see, that movie, I think, raised a couple of very good points. One of them about doubt. Doubt and faith are so integral to one another. We often downplay doubt a lot because it seems like the New Testament does as well. There are so many times that Jesus is talking to his disciples and he says, "Why do you doubt? Stop doubting." When you read the letter to James, he says in the very beginning, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, and you should do so without doubting, because the person who doubts is like a wave blown around by the wind on the sea. So we have this completely negative opinion about doubt. As a matter of fact, we have labeled Thomas as the doubter. That's like the worst title you could have, short of being Judas the betrayer. And yet, we often read or look over this little verse in the single chapter letter of Jude, verse 22, which says this: "Be merciful to those who doubt." You see, faith is a journey. We all experience moments where we're moving forward and other moments where we're moving backward. We doubt ourselves. We doubt our abilities. We doubt our call. We doubt our understanding of God. Sometimes we even doubt God himself. But God, just like with Thomas, keeps working with us through our doubts until our faith gets strengthened. It's interesting, even in the movie, Father Flynn's opening sermon is, when you find yourself lost, know that you are not alone. And then Sister Aloysius at the end, when she confesses her doubts, feels completely alone. She actually plays in a sense, into that sermon, even though she cannot stand Father Flynn and her and him have gone in completely different directions. She actually sort of lives into his sermon in the beginning. That's quite fascinating, and that's what I think good movies do. We see in them reflections of ourselves. We see in them problems that we also are struggling with, and we see in them opportunities for faith and healing and growth. So I wonder, what are some good movies that you have seen that have actually encouraged your faith and encouraged you? I'd love to see maybe comments in the section below so I can see some of the recommended movies that you've watched and liked that have been impactful upon your life. Or even if you know me, and you can email me, or when you see me face to face, share with me. I'm always looking for a good movie, one that can encourage me, one that I can think about and meditate on, and one that I can look for God in the details of. So that's my hope for what cinema can do for you. And maybe watch some good movies, especially during these times of pandemic and in these ongoing times of pandemic. The peace of God be with you. Amen.